Okay, hopefully it's on, ready to go. All right, so this is my presentation on the Second Sino-Japanese War. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that right. Um, make sure I got one thing set up. All right, perfect. Okay, so the Second Sino-Japanese War. Um, so first off, you may be wondering what the Second Sino-Japanese War has to do with anything. Well, um, first of all, here's the agenda for the presentation. Um, if you remember the movie that we watched in class, Farewell, My Concubine, it involves events of the Sino-Japanese War that have various effects on the story. Um, if you remember back to the movie, um, they talk about how the Marco Polo Bridge incident is essentially a big part of the story because that's how Duzi and Shitu become opera stars and become Chengdi and Guangjialu. Again, sorry if I mispronounce anything. Um, but that kind of starts the whole opera thing for them. Um, Obviously, you remember how the Japanese occupation was a big part of it. Um, well, one of the reasons that I wanted to look at this was because in the story they talk about it when it's happening, but I don't believe they provide much context to it, which is the reason why I wanted to do this. Um, so, let's get into it. Let's see. All right. Um, so what was the Second Sino-Japanese War? So, this was a conflict that started all because of Japanese imperialism. So, Japan essentially in the aftermath of World War One and the Great Depression, um, Japan wanted to expand politically and militarily in order to secure access to raw food, materials, because obviously with the Great Depression, um, those resources became more prominent and important than ever in order for people to survive. Um, so Japanese production, exports, everything essentially came to a head. People became frustrated. That led to kind of a militant nationalism from Japan and the want to expand. And this was led, of course, by Emperor Hirohito, who selected Hideki Chojo to kind of lead the war effort for Japan. Um, and essentially, this is actually pretty similar to something in U.S. history. If you're familiar with the Spanish-American War, was basically started because the U.S. said that a Spanish boat, or partly the reason, a Spanish boat attacked U.S. battleships, and the U.S. used that as a reason to start the war. Controversially, looking back on it, it may not have actually happened or not, which is exactly the same thing that happened here with the Mukden incident. Again, sorry if I mispronounce. Um, but essentially, this incident helped spark the Japanese invasion because um, they essentially blamed China for hostilities that didn't even happen by the Chinese. Like the Japanese military personnel essentially set up this like false thing that happened. It's pretty wild, but I'm not going to get into it too much for the purposes of this presentation. But essentially, that gave Japan a reason to invade Manchuria. So The Chinese were quickly defeated. Japan was able to set up a puppet state called Manchukuo. Again, mispronunciation, I'm sure. And people go back and forth on whether 1931 or 1937 was the start of this war, but essentially this was the start of the Japanese occupation. So from 31 to 37, China and Japan had small engagements. They called them incidents. And that all kind of came to a head in 1937 with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which was where essentially Japanese and Chinese forces began all-out war. And the Japanese immediately went on the offensive. They captured Beijing, they captured Shanghai and Nanjing, which was the Chinese capital at the time, which was a really, really tough time in history because this war was horrible. In fact, I think of World War II and of the World War II era, I believe this was where the most casualties were, at least in the Pacific Theater. Brutal war. And the Chinese government had to relocate to Chongqing, which I actually have, if you look over here where my mouse is on the map, Chongqing is right there represented on the map. And this is kind of actually where China was at this point in the war. Japan was able to push pretty far, but China started getting help, which leads to the Sino-Soviet Treaty, which was where essentially China signed an armistice, or they essentially had an agreement. The nationalist government had an agreement with Russia for support and all sorts of stuff to help with the war effort. And so even though the Chinese army was kind of on the back foot, they were still able to hold Japan, and things kind of came to a stalemate. And on top of that, the U.S. were providing a couple of mercenaries in World War II history. They're known as the Flying Tigers. They were part of the Chinese Air Force sent by America, and America was boycotting Japan with like cutting off steel and fuel exports, which was hampering the Japanese war machine. But so Japan was kind of on the back foot. Well, on top of that, with all the support that the nationalist government was getting, in 1939, they had this huge counteroffensive in central China where they retook a bunch of different cities. The communists, which are actually in red on this map over here, they played a part in this too. They had offensive as well. So essentially, everything was kind of going towards this, and this kind of all came to a head with the start of World War II, which was Japan launching a surprise attack, Pearl Harbor, in December 1941. And the U.S. officially entered the war, and they gave China, at the time, a total of $1.6 billion, which adjusted today is $18.4 billion. So they gave China a lot of money, and they officially started the war with Japan. And so Japan essentially was, from that point on, fighting from the back foot, and ended up obviously surrendering, and that was the end of the war. And if you look, let's see, so aftermath, essentially China emerged powerful as a nation. They're recognized as one of the big four allies, permanent members of the UN Security Council, even to this day, but were economically weak and on the verge of civil war because of just the amount of war and suffering and damage the country had been through. And the nationalist government was corrupt and weak, and they struggled to reconstruct like all the farms and all these places were flooded. It was horrible. Well, essentially, the Communist Party, they played a part in this war too. They were fighting alongside the nationalist side, and they were strengthened to the war because they didn't really take the brunt of the Japanese effort, but they were still able to train their troops. Communist policies, obviously, when there's a lot of poverty, communist policies work very well. And they were also able to arm themselves with captured Japanese equipment after the Japanese surrendered. It was kind of a race to see who would get the equipment first. And the Communist Party ended up getting a lot of that. And whenever they did that, they were able to encircle the nationalist government army. They were in the northeast part of China, and basically led to a quick war and a victory by the Communist Party. And you see that in the movie as well. And so essentially, conclusion, how does this add to the meaning and kind of the understanding of this novel? So these events obviously add background to the story. They explain what's going on and why this was happening, and why this played such an integral part into the story. Hopefully this also helps you understand the ferocity of the Japanese, and subsequently the hate by the Chinese, by all parties involved. Why and how the communists took over, because it's not really explained. And how the different governments and their ideals ended up affecting the people. And you can see that with Zhao Si, who joins the Communist Party and is like really all in on the new government, while the people who have already been there and some of the older people were kind of okay with the nationalist government and weren't really all in on the communist. And you see that play out in real time in the story. So yeah, but essentially, yeah, that was my presentation. Hopefully I was able to give you some background behind what happened. Thank you.